This video is about the different approaches or styles of thematic analysis. If you are trying to do thematic analysis, whether you are a PhD student, a master's student, or involved in a project where perhaps the supervisor wants you to use thematic analysis, or you are thinking about using thematic analysis, then you should be aware that there are different approaches or different styles, or even different schools of thematic analysis. Most people tend to gravitate and go towards Braun and Clarke's thematic analysis, thinking this is it. This is the only method of doing thematic analysis. This is not the case. And the reason why it's not the case, because they themselves had to decipher and talk about the different types of thematic analysis themselves in different resources. So one of the resources that come from them that talked about the different approaches of thematic analysis, which I would suggest reading, is by them, Virginia Braun and Victoria Clarke, Hayfield and Terry, which is a book chapter called Thematic Analysis in a book called Handbook of Research Methods in Health and Social Sciences, which I've put in on the slides with the DOI number for you to check and have a look. And the particular pages are 843 to 860. So these authors, what they did, they mapped the terrain of thematic analysis. Thematic analysis to them is really a method for capturing patterns or themes across qualitative databases. So this is the first thing that you need to know. What is the thematic analysis as an analysis technique? Something to bear in mind is that there are three distinct approaches or schools of thematic analysis under one umbrella. And these are called or referred to as coding reliability, codebook, and reflexive thematic analysis, which is the last one is the approach by Braun and Clarke. The authors considered these as having radically very different conceptualizations of what a theme represents, with different methods for theme identification and development, as well as coding. This is something important that I decided to put on a slide. It's why, in particular, Braun and Clarke and the other authors thought that thematic analysis is an often misconceptualized approach because it's often seen as a single analytic approach by most people. So it is crucial to keep in mind that although Braun and Clarke talked the most, as I mentioned earlier, about thematic analysis, their approach and style is really separate and distinct from the other styles of thematic analysis, which have their specific style, theory of how they approach analysis, their authors even, their ways of generating themes, and you should be aware about their differences, and you should be comfortable with your analysis approach selection and even defend it and explain it. So let's talk about these three different approaches, which I thought I'll put each in one separate slide. So the first one is coding reliability. Coding reliability approaches are those known by authors such as Boyatzis from 1998, Gus et al. From 2012, and I believe the Jove 2011. There is typically an underlying positivist logic behind their processes, and you can read more about positivist logic in a different session, but I thought about using Wikipedia to kind of give you an idea about what positivism means. It's a philosophical stance that critiques and refines positivism, particularly in social sciences and research methodologies. This philosophy acknowledges the inherent subjectivity of knowledge and the influence of the researcher's background and perspectives on research findings, while still seeking objective understanding through rigorous methods. So just to give you a very quick idea about what does that mean. Themes usually, in these kinds of coding reliability approaches, themes usually derive the coding process and represent outputs of the coding process. Coding is typically guided by, and this is important to keep in mind, they are usually, the whole guiding exercise is usually and typically is guided by codebook or coding frame. These codes themes usually have a label or name, a definition, information on how to identify the code or theme, and a description of any exclusions and examples of data. The coding reliability approach is designed to let researchers categorize the data into predetermined themes. Coding is the process for identification of theme-relevant data, hence themes. More than one coder can apply the codebook to the data. Levels of agreement between coders can then be calculated using what they called Cohen's kappa, which is a score of 0.80 and above which usually indicates accurate or reliable coding. And that's why it's called coding reliability. The approach can be understood as a consensus to coding approach, as it builds towards a singular, shared, and correct analysis of the data. This approach is often described by Braun and Clarke as having a small q, or qualitative research approach, in that the qualitative research part is concerned with how tools and techniques of the approach are conceptualized, and not that qualitative research is conceptualized as a paradigm by itself or an underlying philosophy for research. So this is, again, another thing to keep in mind when you're looking between differences of thematic analysis techniques. As a result of that, the authors conceptualize this approach as partially qualitative. They view this approach as a problem in that it discards and dismisses the depth of engagement brought by commitments and rigor in open-ended and flexible values for qualitative research quality. And it abandons the open and exploratory design, if you like, and analytic process, and gives less priority to researchers, your subjectivity and your reflections. Let's look at the second branch or the second school of thematic analysis, what they called codebook. So codebook thematic analysis, this second set of thematic analysis approaches includes the work the works by the following authors. It includes the framework approach by Ritchie and Spencer, 1994, Ritchie and Lewis, 2003, Smith and Firth, 2011, the template analysis approach by King and Brooks, 2015 and 14, and the matrix analysis by Miles and Huberman from 1994, Naden and Caswell from 2014, among many others. So you could see there are so many different types of codebook technique which falls under this thematic analysis or the second set of thematic analysis approaches. These do not use the actual term, by the way, of thematic analysis. And this approach sits between coding reliability and reflexive thematic analysis techniques, where they have a structured approach to coding with coding reliability thematic analysis, but with the broadly qualitative underlying philosophy of reflexive thematic analysis technique by Braun and Clarke. Themes are determined in advance of the full analysis. These are conceptually viewed as domain summaries. The author sees the benefit of using a codebook framework in terms of for teams of researchers and qualitative beginners, if you like, allowing easier collaborative work and quick analytic process. However, pragmatic factors should not be, as they call it, the main determinant of the method. And then we've got the final the final style of thematic analysis, which is called reflexive thematic analysis. This includes the author's own approach to thematic analysis, which is by very famous approach by Braun and Clarke, as well as other authors such as, which they mentioned, by Langdridge from 2004. This approach is considered fully qualitative. Data analysis and collection are underpinned by a qualitative philosophy or paradigm. So really, this sets this method apart from the other two qualitative thematic analysis approaches, where there is a big, what they called a big Q approach. Qualitative worldview here refers to an orientation where the emphasis is really placed on meaning as contextual or situated, on reality or realities as multiple, and on your researcher or you as the student, your subjectivity as a resource rather than just being valid. The role of the researcher here within this approach is therefore active in the knowledge production process. Themes are a product of considerable analytic work on your part to explore and develop an understanding of patterned meaning across the dataset. Coding is considered organic and an open iterative process. It is not fixed from the beginning, whether through the use of a code book or a coding frame like the other two approaches. Codes in here can evolve throughout the coding process, where a code can be split into two or more codes, renamed or combined with others, therefore aiming to capture the conceptualization of the data. And I've done other videos already about this reflexive thematic analysis technique by Braun and Clarke where you can go and have a look at to explore this thematic analysis technique. This reflexive thematic analysis technique or approach, it really calls for depth, for a close and critical engagement by going beyond the surface or obvious content of the data. The aim is not really here to summarize the data or minimize the researcher's, your subjectivity and your influence on the analytic process, as neither of these is possible or desirable in this technique. Instead, the aim becomes to provide a coherent and compelling interpretation of the data grounded in the data themselves. The authors described, Braun and Clarke and the other authors described you, the researcher within the TA approach, as a storyteller, actively engaged in the interpretation process using the following lenses: your own, cultural membership, and social positioning, your theoretical assumptions and ideological commitments, and your scholarly knowledge as a researcher. The reflexive thematic analysis researcher is usually driven by social justice. This is how they see it, in that he or she is motivated by trying to give voice to groups rarely allowed to speak or allowed to be heard in a specific context, or those socially marginalized groups, or that they have a moral radical agenda of social critique or change. And this is why this technique also appealed to my own, my own research. And I used it to partly engage with and drive my data analysis technique. So hopefully this video gave you an idea about the different types of thematic analysis and also gave you some sort of an appreciation that there are different schools of thematic analysis technique or styles that you should pay attention to and you should read, because your thematic analysis might actually, or your data analysis might fall into other types of thematic analysis that you might not be aware of. And it gives you this understanding really will give you a solid grounding of your data analysis process and exercise.